They laughed at her. The sound was soft and contemptuous, a ripple that passed through a conference room like a dry wind, and Evelyn felt it the way a bruise feels after a hand has brushed too hard, annoying, small, but present. She was pushing her cart down the long glass corridor, the wheels whispering over the polished floor. The cloth in her hand folded the way only someone who has been doing the same job for years can fold it. Her badge hung at her waist, not because she needed it to pass security. She moved through the building as if it almost belonged to her, but because it was company policy, and she obeyed company policy. Every morning had its map: the lobby, the elevators, the third-floor restrooms, the long bank of cubicles where the junior analysts sat with their headphones like crowns. She knew the rhythm of the place. She knew where the coffee got cold, who left crumbs in the break room, which meeting rooms smelled faintly of burnt cognitive effort. She also knew, with the clarity of someone who moves unseen through other people's work, who was overlooked and who believed themselves indispensable. She was not invisible because she wanted to be. She had learned to carry herself small, to make no demands, to answer questions with a single word when asked. It made things smoother. People moved around her the way they move around furniture. They did not notice the scars from years of scrubbing, the calluses on her hands, the way she tucked a stray gray hair behind her ear before entering a boardroom. Those were the private things she kept for herself. That morning, a pair of executives crossed the lobby talking in voices calibrated not to be overheard. Alan Greaves laughed easily, a rich sound that left no room for doubt. "We cut the support teams by 10% last quarter," he said. "Cost centers, you know. If they can't manage 5% productivity, that's not our loss." The other man shrugged. Managers hate it, but numbers are numbers. Evelyn heard the phrase, cost centers, like a blade. She knew what cut beneath the corporate euphemism. She knew whose lunches would go uneaten next month, whose rent check might be late. She knew the intern who would be told to tighten up after an unfortunate spill. She paused, one hand on the cart, just long enough for the crinkling of their laughter to be the only sound in her ears. Small humiliations came like rain in this building, frequent, drenching only the same patch of skin. A junior analyst once made a joke at the holiday party about the help that landed with polite laughter and a sting in Evelyn's chest. An executive once offered her a napkin like a scavenger at a picnic. They meant it as a kindness, she had told herself, but the way they folded their fingers around the edge told a different story. Even a childlike taunt from a summer intern, "You can't be serious, Grandma," had a way of lodging under her ribs. It was not just the words, it was the weight of being not seen. Yet she kept at her tasks. She loved things to be in order. Martin had loved that about her. He had always said she could make a mess of the world and then make it right again by the time the sun set. Martin's hands were gone, but his habits remained. The pocketbook he had loved, the way he kept a list of small restorations to do around the house, the quiet joke he left taped to the underside of the sugar jar. Remember to look up. That phrase, "look up," had become Evelyn's secret instruction. She did not look up to challenge the men in the lobby. She looked up only in the sense of keeping a watchful patience. The world, she believed, had angles and unseen balances. She had learned to notice the things others considered background noise, the pattern on the tiles in the service corridor, a misplaced folder left by a hurried hand, the cadence of sentences that ended in laughter too quick to be sincere. The company's decisions were rarely phrased in moral language. They were spreadsheets and projections and optimizations. When Alan talked about margins, he spoke as if people were a line item. That evening, Evelyn overheard a different calculus. She had been in the break room replacing a burned-out bulb when the intern, young, shaky, new to everything, walked in, drenched and mortified. A spill had soaked his sleeve, and the floor had been slick. He apologized 50 times, voice clipped and bright with anxiety. A manager pointed at the stain and told him, in front of everyone, that carelessness could not be tolerated. The intern's face went white. He muttered that it had been an accident. The manager folded his arms. "You need to learn," the manager said, loud enough for a few to hear. "This place doesn't have room for mistakes." No one asked whether the intern had been adequately trained or whether expectations were realistic. They only needed an example, someone small, to make the rest pay attention. The intern left with his head low. Evelyn wiped the counter, folding the towel in a way that contained her hands from trembling. That night she sat at her kitchen table under the lamp Martin had chosen for her and opened a small notebook. It felt odd, journalistic even, but she had never been a woman to leave odd things half done. She made a list, not of grievances, of facts, dates, names, small precise things. May 17, expense report approved with $12,000 entry. Manager, Tyrell, Department, North Ops. August, 3 HR complaints dismissed as overreactions. Intern incident, public reprimand, no retraining offered. The words were neat. She had a way of writing that made messy things seem manageable. There was a detail she had kept to herself for years and years, the kind of quiet fact that could be said in one sentence and would change how the whole story read. Martin had left her the majority of his shares. He had done it not because he wanted her to rule, but because he believed in stewardship. He believed people mattered, those who cleaned the floors, answered phones, fixed printers. When he fell ill, he had insisted on writing his will with a clarity that surprised the family lawyer. "She knows how to look," he told the lawyer, folding his hands over hers. Evelyn had not wanted the attention. She kept the certificate in a drawer under the false bottom of an old sewing box. It felt like something private. She kept it because Martin had asked her to watch over the shares until the company needed them for good. She never expected the moment to come in the bright daylight of a boardroom with cameras on and microphones off. The notebook grew. The list turned into a dossier. She started with what she knew, the things she personally witnessed, the slights, the cruel jokes, the policies that cut first at the lowest paid. Then she began to ask questions in ways that were small and legal. She requested copies of past newsletters, pulled public filings she could read at the library, called an old friend who had once worked in HR and left quietly. She reached out to one former employee, a woman named Rosa, who had left the company after a hostile reassignment. Rosa spoke on the phone in a way that made Evelyn want to sit very still and listen. She confirmed things Evelyn had suspected, complaints that had been minimized, reassignments that looked like punishment. Evelyn did not become a different person because she had proof. She became more deliberate. She hired, quietly and discreetly, a lawyer through a community legal clinic. The lawyer did not look surprised when she showed up with her neat folder and the sewing box certificate. "This is not uncommon," he said, and he meant that in a sympathetic way. They talked about processes no one could call glamorous. Proxy statements, annual meetings, the way votes were cast in a room filled with people trained to speak in the softest legalese possible. She also talked to an analyst she found through a neighbor. The analyst, a quiet woman who wore sensible shoes and had once been dismissed by the company's PR team as humorless, ran numbers and read filings with Evelyn until Evelyn began to understand the language of balance. They made no plans for revenge. They made plans for accountability. Evelyn insisted on that. Her measure of success would be not the humiliation of any single man, but the restoration of systems where dignity might be preserved. Days became a rhythm of small legal acts. Evelyn attended the public parts of shareholder meetings tucked in the back, a cleaning cart parked outside like a loyal sentinel. She listened. She observed. She took notes. In the lunchroom, she would sometimes ask discreet, guarded questions of a board member who offered small talk. "How does the company track the impact of these layoffs?" she asked once, casually. And the man looked at her as though she had asked a strange riddle. "Margins," he said. "Efficiency." She nodded. It was a word that had hollowed out a lot of human things. At night she practiced speaking. She rehearsed only to keep her voice steady. She never wanted to be theatrical. She wanted truth to land. Her notebook filled with headlines and observations and statements she imagined saying aloud. "We have a record of complaints that were not addressed. We have an accountant's report showing irregular expense entries. We have a moral obligation to the people who make this company possible." The sentences were plain and determined. Her voice was not large, but it carried. The day of the annual shareholders' meeting arrived with a corporate gloss, a glass facade, a carpet that swallowed footsteps, a catering table where foreign cheeses shone. The executive suite filed in with faces arranged like trophies. Alan Greaves stepped up to the podium in a suit cut to make him look smaller and more in control than he felt. He smiled in a way that meant a table footnote had been conveniently ignored. He had the confidence of a man used to being the center of a narrative. Evelyn had dressed for the meeting as she always did. Clean shirt, sensible shoes, a cardigan Martin had liked. She had pinned a small brooch to her lapel, a brass thing in the shape of a feather. It was her private sign, the idea that small things can still fly. She carried her notebook and her sewing box certificate in a brown folder. When she took her seat in the gallery, she placed her cart outside. Security eyed it, and then the building manager shrugged. She had a pass, and the cart was a piece of the company's daily scenery. No one pointed at it and laughed. They had other things to do. The meeting began with the usual liturgy, reports, numbers, a rehearsed optimism that did not touch the rows of employees whose names were not on the stage. There was a Q&A section supposedly meant to include ordinary shareholders. A handful of investors asked questions about growth. Alan answered with the practiced brevity of someone who believed words were props, not responsibilities. Evelyn's moment came like a breath after a held inhale. She stood and crossed the room slowly, the cart behind her. A few heads turned, some with the curiosity a passerby earns when they step out of their expected place. Alan glanced across the room and, with the arrogant nonchalance of someone used to small interruptions, quirked an eyebrow as if amused. She did not go to the podium. She walked to the table where the board sat, where the chairman's placard glinted in the light. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it filled the room the way a clear bell does. "My name is Evelyn Harper," she said, "and I'm a shareholder." There was a beat, then a ripple. A reporter leaned forward. An executive's laugh came out too quick and brittle. "You? The cleaning staff?" someone muttered, and a low chorus of amusement moved like a small storm through the room. It landed on Evelyn with the soft cruelty it had always carried. But she did not step back. She placed the brown folder on the board's table and opened it. Inside were neat piles of photocopies, margin notes, the sewing box certificate with Martin's name written in the careful script of the lawyer's attestation. She had not hidden the fact that she owned the shares because she had sought to surprise with a melodramatic moment. She had not wanted her life to be a spectacle. She had come prepared because she had learned that truth matters most when it is legible and plainly offered. "I am the majority shareholder," she said, and this time the sentence had a weight that made papers flutter on nearby desks. "Martin Harper left me his shares. I have watched this company for years. I have watched people be treated as expendable. I've brought evidence." She set the first report before the chairman, a packet that summarized the patterns she'd documented, suppressed HR complaints, expense accounts with unexplained large transfers, a series of decisions that had systematically reduced staff in support roles while executive compensation rose. The language was not sensational. It was plain and legalistic on purpose. Pattern of reassignments correlated with complaints. Expense anomalies consistent with misallocation. Failure to address HR escalations. There was a pause that stretched longer than anyone expected. Alan's smile thinned. He tried to deflect with a joke about statements from the peanut gallery, but this room was not interested in a one-liner any longer. Shareholders, people with small stakes, big stakes, indifferent stakes, began to stir. The chairman peered at the documents. One by one, board members read. The color drained from a face here. A jaw tightened somewhere else. The analyst Evelyn had consulted sat at the back with a hand over her mouth as if to keep from gasping. An old friend from HR, who had come without fanfare to offer corroboration, sat with her hands folded because she feared the blowback. Evelyn did not rattle. She spoke calmly and directly. "These are not just numbers," she said. "They are decisions that have names, people who were reassigned, families who cut back, interns who were publicly shamed. This was all done under the guise of efficiency. I cannot accept that." The board whispered among themselves. The chairman cleared his throat. "Ms. Harper," he said, "we appreciate your attention to detail, but matters of executive leadership are complex. We will review your documents." "Review," Evelyn echoed. "We can review in committee, or we can address it now. The question before this meeting is whether the board has confidence in the current CEO. It was a legal term dressed in corporate clothing, but readers and listeners in that room understood its force. A vote of confidence was a direct mechanism. A majority shareholder could influence its outcome. Evelyn could have asked for private arbitration. She did not. She had watched the pattern of private meetings and quiet settlements and had concluded that the company needed a public accounting. Alan stood, his voice pitched higher. "This is theater," he said. "We have processes. If she has a complaint, there are channels." "The channels failed," Evelyn said simply. "They failed for the people who could not afford to have them fail." The vote was called. The chairman, with a stiff expression, asked for those in favor of maintaining confidence in the CEO to raise their hands. Fingers went up, slow at first, then more certain. When the vote turned to the shareholder ballot, Evelyn produced the proxy forms she had collected, the legal counsel's note validating their legitimacy. Her papers counted as more than simple numbers. They counted because someone had once trusted her with something that mattered. Board members huddled in that quick corporate whisper that fills a room like static. Alan tried to argue. He pointed to growth figures, to the stock's relative performance. He tried to make the narrative about markets and global pressures. People in the room listened, but a new story had entered the air. That the company had been valuing the wrong things. The chairman looked at the rotating pile of papers as if it were a scale. When the final tally was announced, it took a breath to register. The chairman repeated the count. "By a majority vote of the shareholders present, and by proxy," he said, voice half formal, half incredulous. "The board no longer has confidence in the CEO." Alan's face collapsed into something like surprise and then anger. "You can't. This is a witch hunt," he spat. "You have no experience running a company. You're a cleaner." Evelyn met his eyes. There was no gloating. There was only the quiet insistence of a woman whose patience had been a preparation, not a pose. "I'm a steward," she said. "I am someone who believes the work this company does must be done with dignity." Security came to escort Alan out. It was not a dramatic wrestle. It was an office occurrence rendered dramatic by the magnitude of what had transpired. He gathered his briefcase with the mechanical courtesy of a man realizing his script had been rewritten. Some employees cheered, softly, like an instinctive exhale. Others looked stunned. In the gallery, the intern who had been humiliated weeks earlier watched with eyes that were wet. He mouthed, "Thank you," in a way Evelyn could clearly see. Evelyn did not take joy in Alan's removal. She had not sought spectacle. Yet there was relief, a release like the first good wash after a long winter. The board moved quickly to appoint an interim committee and to call for an immediate independent audit. Evelyn insisted on the terms. The audit would be independent, the HR grievances would be reviewed by an outside panel, and an ethics committee would be formed with seats reserved for non-executive employees, including a representative from the cleaning staff. Her list had become a plan for accountability rather than revenge. In the days that followed, the building felt altered. It was still the same glass and steel, but the hum vibrated with different stories. People who had never spoken to Evelyn before began to pass her in the corridor with a nod. A few apologized without having to, their faces reddened by a recognition of small cruelties. The intern came to the break room and, without fanfare, left a sticky note on her cart that read, "For seeing us." She kept the note folded into her pocket like a small treasure. Evelyn's leadership was not theatrical. She refused to be a figurehead who barked orders from an office whose windows looked down on the city. She instituted listening sessions. She sat down with custodial staff in a conference room and offered them coffee and a chance to speak about their schedules and their concerns. She asked questions, and more importantly, she listened. When someone asked for clearer paths for promotion, she did not promise a ladder instantly. She promised transparency, a set of steps that anyone could follow. She prioritized a few things with the economy of someone who knows money must be spent wisely. Wages for the lowest paid staff were adjusted. HR practices were revised to ensure complaints were recorded and responded to by an independent committee. The company established a small fund to assist employees in crisis, rent emergencies, sudden childcare needs. because sometimes the difference between staying and leaving was a matter of a single day's pay. Evelyn also insisted on more rigorous disclosure of expenses. She did not relish the idea of poring through ledgers the way she had when preparing for the meeting, but she had learned that accountability required work, dull and exact. The board authorized an audit and appointed people from outside the old networks. They invited former employees to speak with investigators. The process was not quick. There were legal motions and careful reviews. There were people on the board who resisted, visibly shocked at the scale of their own oversight. Yet the culture shifted, not overnight, but with deliberate steps. At a town hall a month later, Evelyn stood at a simple podium in a conference room that used to be reserved for sales meetings. The audience was mixed: junior staff, senior managers, others who had watched the smaller dramas of daily life unfold. She spoke plainly about what she had hoped for, not to humiliate, but to heal. "I don't want this company to be a place where people dread coming to work," she said. "We can do better." An HR director handed a microphone to the intern, the same young man who had been shamed. He spoke quietly at first, then with gathering strength. He described how the public reprimand had made him consider quitting. "I almost left," he said, "but something made me stay. I guess I wanted to know if someone would notice." People in the room shifted. A few clapped. Evelyn folded her hands and looked at him the way someone might look at a friend who had told a truth that needed to be heard. "We noticed," she said. "And we will notice from now on." Change, Evelyn knew, would have to be practical. She did not imagine changing everything. There were structural constraints and market pressures that remained, but she could influence the culture. She could insist that those at the top be accountable to those whose labor kept the lights on. The board instituted clear policies about escalating complaints, about documenting HR processes, and about transparent reporting of major expenditures. A new CEO search followed a month later, and the chosen candidate was someone with a reputation for ethical leadership rather than pure growth metrics. Evelyn's days returned to their familiar map, but now the card and the badge carried a different gravity. People stopped to say hello. A team of managers, prompted by the new culture, stopped assuming they had all the answers. The company's headlines in the press were tempered with nuance. The story of a cleaning staff member who had, legally and firmly, used what she had to demand better for others. Not all relationships mended instantly. There were board members who retired with their reputations intact, but their credibility diminished. There were employees who remained skeptical of change, raised by the habits of previous years. Evelyn herself had moments of second-guessing, nights when the quiet of her kitchen felt like a room in which decisions weighed heavily. She sometimes found herself awake, replaying a moment in the meeting, wondering if she had said enough, or too much, if she had put people at risk by pressing forward so publicly. And yet there were smaller measures that told a different story. A maintenance worker who had once been ignored was given a formal recognition at an all-staff meeting. The intern, after a few months of mentorship and support, moved into a full-time junior analyst role. Rosa, the former employee who had spoken with Evelyn in the early days, was invited to lead one of the HR workshops on respectful workplaces. They were not dramatic trophies. They were small restorations that meant dignity returned in increments. In the end, Evelyn's victory was neither flashy nor vengeful. She had not sought to humiliate Alan so much as to remove the conditions that made his behavior possible. When he left the building for the last time, the security guard closed the door with a professional finality, not a flourish. The man was an exemplar of a system that had tolerated a certain kind of arrogance. The system changed because a steward decided it must. Months later, Evelyn stood outside the company's main entrance as autumn made the city sky the color of old coins. She rested her hand on her cart and watched employees stream in, each carrying burdens and hopes she could only know in glimpses. A gust of wind stirred a loose paper against the threshold. She picked it up and tucked it into the pocket of her cardigan. The brooch at her lapel caught the sun and winked. A delivery driver paused and waved. The intern walked past and lifted his head in a small, deliberate nod. Evelyn tucked the sticky note he had left into the inside of her pocket, where Martin's old certificate rested. She felt no triumphal gloating. Her satisfaction was quieter, like the sense of a house set in order after a storm. This was not the end of a story so much as the beginning of another kind of work, the slow labor of maintaining dignity where systems had previously eroded it. She understood fully that one meeting did not fix everything, and that the processes she had set in motion required vigilance. But she also knew that sometimes patience is not passivity. Sometimes it is a long preparation that arrives at an exact moment and turns an old culture on its head. People still joked sometimes in easy and clumsy ways about the cleaning lady who fired the CEO. The phrase circulated in headlines for a week, distilled into clickbait and snappy talk show segments. Evelyn never minded the shorthand. It simplified a complicated truth into a digestible line. The fuller story, the months of careful gathering, the conversations with legal counsel, the sleepless nights, was hers to hold. She preferred the long version anyway. It made room for the people who mattered most. On a quiet weekday, she was invited to a small ceremony in the atrium. A plaque was unveiled for the custodial staff, honoring their decades of work. The plaque did not make up for everything neglected in the past. It was nonetheless an acknowledgement. Evelyn stood beside Rosa and the intern, and together they accepted the applause. It was modest and earnest, the kind of recognition that meant someone in a corner office noticed the cost of invisibility. As they filed back to their routines, Evelyn pushed her cart with the same sure hands. The cart's wheel squeaked once in the stairwell. The sound had been a motif of her life, and she smiled because patterns can be beautiful. She had been mocked. She had been overlooked. She had been asked to be small. Then she had stood up and done the work she thought necessary to change that, not for show, but out of a stubborn fidelity to the life she had chosen. She had used what Martin trusted her with not for power, but for responsibility. People would remember the headline. Those who had shared in the small cruelties of everyday life might never change. But for one company, and for the men and women whose livelihoods depended on it, a different standard took hold. A standard that asked leaders to be accountable and reminded everyone that dignity is not a bonus. It is the essential currency of any community. Evelyn walked on, cart in hand, the city reflecting in the building's glass like a promise. She did not pretend the work was finished. She understood that watchfulness must be a lifelong practice. But she also felt the clean satisfaction of a job well done, the quiet, honest pleasure of a floor left spotless, a room arranged with care, a life set back on course. If you believe dignity matters, like or share this story. And if a moment like this moves you, subscribe for more stories about quiet people who change systems in small, lasting ways.